Jim, let me just begin by congratulating you on this series. It's been going for a long time. We've had a lot of great speakers here, a lot of great people from the legislature coming sort of year after year to give our students an update. What a treat for our students, learning in the classroom and then learning from people that are in the political arena. Is just a fabulous learning experience for our students, so I want to thank you. And it's a great pleasure to introduce our two guests today, Chairman of the Higher Education Committee in the Senate and in the House, in the center of higher education policy in our state. Let me first start with the Senate, Chairman Sen Seligers, and in the House, Chairman Dan Branch. And we want to leave all the time for them, but let me just say a couple of brief things about each of them. These two legislative leaders, elected officials, are exactly the model that we want to have in our legislature. They represent their districts, as they should, and they represent all of Texas, making policy, leading policy on where higher education ought to be in Texas, how it fits into public education, obviously how it fits into budgets. These are two legislative leaders who listen. They think deep and hard about what is the best course of action for our state. And they work well, coming up with solutions to real problems. Just very briefly, I remember when Chairman Branch first became chair of the House Higher Education Committee, he went all over the state in the interim with his committee, taking testimony from citizens in different parts of the state. And I remember the first one of those was in the Valley. And one of the things, Chairman Branch is from, represents Dallas. Chairman Seliger represents Amarillo. I remember you're going out and visiting the Technical Institute in the Valley, learning a great deal about it and coming back and talking about that at the committee. That is actually finding out what's going on the ground. There are a lot of different aspects of higher education in the state, out listening to citizens, to people, what are the issues and what are the problems that need to be solved. Chairman Seliger has been at this a few months now, a couple of months, has been a very leading senator in his own right in the Senate, but as chairman of the Higher Education Committee. I have personally been to at least 4 or 5 sessions like this where Chairman Seliger is listening to people in higher education, listening to other people, trying to get a broad view of what's best for higher education in the state. These are two leaders in higher education that we are so fortunate to have in our legislature. So with that, I welcome them always to our campus. Thank you.
Welcome back, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Been here by yourselves several times between you, and it's nice to have you together. We really appreciate it, and thanks to the folks in your office for helping arrange this too. It was very easy, much easier than I would have thought to get 2 chairmen here in one day. So you guys are terrific. And
thank you.
Thank you, Jim. It's always good to be back. Just going to say, got the T-shirt and the tie, shamelessly pandering. So
you're doing a pretty great job, and we've really not even started.
So getting invited back is the big thing, because now you've had a chance to see what we say and how we say it. To get invited back for round 2, it's very nice.
I'm glad you feel that way. I want to start globally with kind of the outlook for higher education this time. It's obviously what we're here to talk about for the most part. 2 years ago at this stage of the cycle, it was pretty grim. I mean, across the board, but any of these discussions and discussions certainly we had when you were here had there was a bit of a pall over everything because of the fiscal situation and, dare I say, because of the political climate. I think the political climate was a little more pitched at that point, and you might disagree with that. So what is your sense of the budget situation right now in each of your chambers, how I want to start, and how is that going to play on how the legislature confronts higher education policy this time around? And Senator Seliger, I want to start with you since I know you have a Finance Committee meeting Monday on this.
The budget situation is much better, obviously, with a $27 billion structural deficit going into the last biennium. And this time, if we look at all funds, monies that must be paid to previous years and Medicaid and things like that, there's going to be about $4.5 billion that, for all practical purposes, we will call a surplus. Keep in mind, though, that any surplus butts up against the constitutional spending limit, so there's a good chance we can't spend the money that we have. It's part of the Constitution, and the hurdle is pretty high to go in and spend that. In addition, projected by 2015, is going to be $11 billion in the Economic Stabilization Fund, which people call the Rainy Day Fund. There's already a plan. One of them is mine to get in there and use some of that money for one of the most pressing areas that we have in the state of Texas, which is water infrastructure. And so it's tough. 2 years ago, we told everybody no, there wasn't enough money. This time, we kind of have to set priorities and pick winners and losers. I would argue that sometimes that's even tougher.
And do you think there's a particular feel for that in the Senate this time you could talk about, or it's still too early?
It's too early, but priorities don't change. Public education, higher education, healthcare, primarily Medicaid, transportation, criminal justice, obviously. We also have a system of parks that are very valuable to the people of the state of Texas. They all compete all the time. And this time, it's less about the net dollars available than there is the competition for those dollars.
How's it looking from the House, Chairman Branch?
Yeah, I agree with the Senator's point of view, and similar in the House. And I would say that specifically to higher ed, briefly, then I'll broaden to some of the other issues, because I think we agree on a need to prepare for the oncoming onslaught and the onslaught that's already here. I mean, Texas, I think one of the great headlines about Texas is, and you're starting to see it picked up more and more in the media, and I think even among policymakers, something I've been talking about for a while is that we were growing really fast. We have dynamic growth in our state, and so at some point, when a business or a country or a state is growing really fast, at some point you got to worry about capacities of basic infrastructure like water, and the Senator's taking a lead on, and education, educated workers, and a knowledge economy, roads, transportation, mobility, power. We don't want to have these peaks where we have brownouts or blackouts, and so I'm excited that I think we're all starting to focus on, to me, the headline, will Texas successfully manage its dynamic growth? I mean, I think that's one of the great questions that everyone's happening, because clearly the growth is coming. Remember, we added 4 congressional seats for this last election cycle. No other state added 4 new congressional seats. No other state added 3 new congressional seats. Only a few added 2. So California was flat. And so it's clear that we're hot in the sense that everyone's coming our way, and so we want to make sure we have the scale to take in all this, whatever it is, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 people a day, Jim, are coming into Texas. So I think it's a good news that our sales taxes have been up, the major source of our revenue, dramatically over 30-something months. And so we have some additional revenues to invest in this basic infrastructure that we've had to let go undernourished, I would say, because of the we're a fiscally prudent, careful state. We balance our budget. We don't spend more than we have. We have limited ability to go into debt, and so. For me, it is a good news. In higher ed particularly, we're seeing the base budgets have come in with formula funding slightly up because of the growth, and special items flat. I think that's something that as we go through the process in Senate Finance or House Appropriations, that we'll see that change, and people will present their needs. We'll have to prioritize, but I hope there's an opportunity to invest in higher education. I think that's really important in a knowledge economy. Not only public ed, but higher ed. And so I'm for one, has been trying to encourage that. And I think we ought to do it carefully, in a smart fashion, because I think higher ed's going through a lot of change, and we're not exactly sure how much will be digital and how much will be real time, and how education gets delivered in going forward. So I think we got to be very careful about our capital investments. We got to make sure that these are things that we want to will stand the test of time if we're going to invest in them. But I hope we get back to getting the message out that higher education. Most economists will agree that there's some sort of anywhere from 8 to 18 x times return. So for every dollar invested, there are many who say the state gets $8 back. When we invest $1 in higher ed, we get $8 back. So it's not only smart in terms of taking care of our future in a knowledge economy. I think it's always been wise to educate your youth and regenerate your civil society. But I think we're also now learning that just the economics of higher education bring great rewards to a state like Texas.
I'm going to come back to that a little bit. I want to follow up on something you said. You mentioned how you seem gratified. You were glad to see that the headlines now were talking about growth and the need to accommodate growth in the state. Now, I don't want to read too much into that, but it does feel a little to me that what's implied there, and I would agree with this, is that the argument in the last couple of cycles was not framed that way. That much of the discussion was really about limiting government, limiting growth, making sure that the top priorities were controlling spending, and the notion of growth seemed to fall out. Am I wrong about that, Senator Seliger?
Yeah, because I don't think one naturally leads to the other. For people like me, growth, be it population, employment, anything else, doesn't imply the need for more government. In some areas, more government attention to details, because there are certain areas in growth that are driven by budget. Certainly when you talk about formulas in public schools, community colleges, and universities. Clearly, unfortunately, criminal justice growth is driven by growth. It doesn't need more government, it needs some more money. And so while some of our involvements change, the attitude about government itself has not really changed. It has become sort of part of the dialect, but Ronald Reagan was not incorrect when he said that government activity is not the answer to the problem. It is the problem. We can mess up more things than we can fix.
So is it?
Yeah, no, I agree. I don't think it's saying that government has to expand. In fact, I would say the opposite. I would say that we may have more sales tax revenues, but what I hope is we will resist the notion to expand government. I hope we'll just focus on core functions of an effective limited government. So for me, as I confess, as a Republican and a conservative, I'm interested in seeing a state government that can do the traditional blocking and tackling. We're here on a big football campus. That can do the blocking and tackling of government well. Right, so our model is we're a limited government state, no question about it. We meet every other year. We have 140 days. We got all kinds of examples of a classically limited government paradigm that goes back to the Reconstruction period, as you know, Professor. And so for me, the question is, will Texas successfully manage its growth with its limited government model in a conservative fashion, a right-of-center fashion? My answer is, will we do education, smart, efficient, productive way? Will we do water capacity? Will we plan and not have a crisis? Will we build the pipes and transmissions and water treatment and reservoirs now, not on the weekend with overtime pay in a crisis? Will we build the power plants and roads in a smart fashion with either general appropriation or some combination of user fees, again in a smart fashion, not in a crisis mode where you have to pay more, and not in a way where you fall short and then people, the perspective or connotation about Texas, oh, don't go there. They have brownouts. They don't have enough roads. They don't have a plan for the water system, and therefore you drive off economic development because you've sent a message that you're not ready. So whether you're not ready or whether you're constructing late in a crisis mode, those aren't conservative. Those are to me, those are big government approaches, and I don't want to go that way. But I do think a limited government ought to have conservative solutions for the basic infrastructure. And let me define, in the knowledge economy, education is infrastructure. It is human capital, prepared human capital. So we better have a workforce ready, and we better have the other basics: water, power, transportation. If we have those, then I think the future for Texas is bright. I think people say we prepared, we got ready, and they came. And they came in huge numbers because they like low taxes and they like regulation. They like a lot of opportunity. And so would continue to be a great example of a limited government that's effective, that takes care of its basics ahead of time, plans for it.
That seems to me to be pretty close to the vision that, or at least the tenor of what Speaker Strauss said on opening day, in terms of, to me, he quoted Teddy Roosevelt in this book. The way both of you are talking about this sounds to me to be the first Roosevelt-ish in that sense. It's a kind of progressive Republican ideal. Is that fair? And I know we're not supposed to say progressive and Republican in the same breath, and I don't want to put you on the spot on that. But there does seem to be a couple of some contending visions within your party right now about how we accommodate change. Is that fair to observe?
Well, I would say for me the model is limited government. What is a conservative is someone who's interested in less government, just enough government. We're not anarchists into no government. We're not libertarians into nearly no government. We're not into anemic or anorexic government. Our standard is limited government. Now we can have a reasonable, robust discussion about what is limited government in 21st century Texas. But that's what conservatives should be about, true conservatives. And so for me, a true conservative discussion is a reasonable discussion about what are the basic functions that we should be delivering. And we ought to be doing it in a smart, effective manner so that people say, hey, conservatives can govern. They can keep taxes low and regulation right, but they also, at some point, if there's too many potholes, or if they can't move around Austin, Texas between 5 and 7 at night, or the water doesn't turn on, or the power has too many brownouts and blackouts, someone's going to say, hey, who's in charge? Who's delivering basic functions? Can conservatives do that?
Yeah. Okay, so I don't want to make you guys split ideological hairs too much here.
And we're not going to, but the one thing we must avoid is the old philosophical observation that the role of a bureaucracy is to perpetuate the bureaucracy. And Dan's model of limited government is if we need people to work for the government, if we have a bunch more prisons, you're going to have a bunch more people work in prisons. We have universities in this system. Take UT Tyler. One of these days is going to have to be 15,000 people. There are going to be some more government employees, but not for the sake of working for the government. A lot of the fractiousness that you observe in the Republican Party is very real. And those schisms are, I think we're going to find that we have to heal them. And there is going to be the will. Somebody made the observation in the New York Times, and it was the same day, interestingly, there was a Rick Santorum editorial. It might have been his observation that to an awful lot of people, the Republican Party looks like a party of aging white men, which is the death knell of our majority, I think, in the United States, because the growth in the population is going to be a thing other than white males. And so we're talking about our very adaptability, which I think is a better subject, a more important subject to people like us than the fact that there seems to be a little division.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
As I recall, there was a little division between the Yarborough and the Conley wings of the Democratic Party.
Well, I think it's fair to say that a lot of times these divisions historically have been in part a function of success.
Yeah.
Too big a majority, right?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so what would each of you like to achieve in higher education this session? Senator Seliger?
What we'd like to achieve, I would like to, we're going to fund formula. I would like to have more money to put into formula. I would like to fund higher education construction, which we must quit referring to as tuition revenue bonds because they have no association with tuition revenue whatsoever. I would like to fund them out of cash. And quite frankly, when you look at the Economic Stabilization Fund and funds that will be available in excess of the constitutional spending limit, We will have one-time occurring funds for one-time occurring projects. I'd like to fund that way. I think one of the most valuable values of conservatives in this country is one, to be debt averse. As a small businessman, we live on debt averseness, and I think that's a very important principle.
You know, this morning, I mean, I was going to ask you this later, but since you raised it, this morning at the Texas Tribune event with Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst, in preparation for this, I asked him a question about higher ed to get material for this. And one of the relatively few specific things he said was he would be interested in tuition revenue bonds. Have you guys heard about this? Have he talked about this already? I'm
in favor of the expenditure and opposed to the debt.
How about yourself? What would you like to see? Come June, what do you want to look back and feel like, hey, we got this done?
Yeah, I mean, 2 years ago, it's sort of like Groundhog Day. 2 years ago, I was saying as we came into the session, it would be important to look at strategic capital investments, which is what I'd rather call them, as opposed to tuition revenue bonds. No one knows what that means. It doesn't really have a lot of connection to reality. But to me, you know, if a campus like this campus has a vetted need, that we need an engineering education and research center, for example, and you're sitting there saying, okay, it's gone through the vetting process. Here we're at the premier universities in the state, one of the premier universities in the country, and we have a 1953 engineering building, and we're trying to attract and retain the best and brightest in engineering, a STEM field that everyone says is important to the future of our state. And we're going to tell some guy from MIT, hey, come on down. We got a really cool 1953 building, and with low ceilings, no closets, and a small master bath. The tendency is it's hard to attract the best and brightest. I mean, they want to come where there's really good equipment and good tools for the future, and do their research and have laboratories. And so, at some point, you know, there's certain projects where you say, do we need a facility? Are we going to build a facility for the future with digital delivery of content? And how do we think science and engineering is going to be taught? And we're going to be really careful and build a building that can be adaptable as things change. But we're going to have a first-class piece of equipment that will make money ultimately for the citizens of Texas by bringing really smart people and really smart students to this campus, a premier campus in the nation that needs to have a premier engineering brain. Then it seems to me the legislature, the policymakers ought to get behind that sort of a project. And there's other examples across the state, but since we're here at UT, that's one.
And do you think, let me ask you this then, do you think they will? What's your sense of you know, how your colleagues are viewing higher education right now?
And I'm not going to pick on the senator because we passed this in the House last time, but at some point it takes two chambers, and he wasn't that wasn't his area of responsibility. So my view is, you know, we have to make the case, and it behooves people like the chairman and myself to, along with the appropriators and the leadership, to make the case. And you know, if we don't make the case effectively, then I think I've failed in my position to make the case to make a sound, solid investment in higher ed that'll actually is conservative, because the way we're doing it, pay as you go, will actually bring a really solid return. And if we don't do it, I mean, to me, if we don't do it, we're going to hurt our state, hurt this university, hurt the ability to teach engineering with the best minds and the best faculty. So at some point, you got to make the case.
And I think while we will see some diverse opinions about method of financing, it is not very difficult to make the case that these capital projects are needed. This is a growing state. It's going to grow in the next 20 years or so from 25 million to 40 million people. We need that to be an educated workforce. We have to ensure that there is going to be a seat in a college or university classroom for every one of those people, and we will compete for the best, both in terms of students and faculty. So can we make the case for the capital investment? Easily. The details are in the money.
Because it's called a capacity, right?
Absolutely.
It's the whole issue of growth and capacity. And it's also the argument, if someone wants to go a debt route, is it prudent to go at a time when you have below historical norms in terms of interest rates, and you have low construction costs? So Yeah, I think someone would say, well, that's more conservative than doing it at a time when you have high rates and high construction costs. So again, doing it being smart about the investment. I think ultimately the real test, I think for a lot of campuses, are you proposing a facility, a long-term investment in creating academic capacity or research capacity that will withstand, you know, the amortization, the time? Is it going to be a 50-year building? And if so, 60-year building? If so, can you show us that we can have this thing evolve and be productive for a long time to come, in light of the crucible that higher ed is going through, because digital content is changing, how you teach and educate is changing, and how budgets are working is changing, and how accountable systems is. So does it sort of fit the current paradigm that higher ed's under? This crucible that I talk about going through, is it going to withstand the test of time? And if so, then, you know, I think it's something that then is worthy of Texas investing in.
Well, it does seem to me that institutions have responded to the discussions of the last 4 to 6 years and the shift in revenue, the revenue environment for higher education to some degree. I mean, we've had, and it's sometimes contentious discussion of that in the last couple of cycles, but for example, we opened the new liberal arts building today. That building deployed a bunch of new innovative building techniques, came in, last I heard, $8 to $10 million under the original budget estimates. So I think there is some response going out there to the discussion that's been going on, don't you?
You do it, it's inevitable. Whenever you're moving lots of money around and you're under one pressure or another, people are sort of adaptable. And in an environment where you have all the money you can use, you have certain spending priorities or building priorities, and when money's tight, you change those priorities. And then what becomes a priority is efficiency. But we also have to talk about what real needs are. And when you talk about looking toward the future, when institutions like the University of Texas Tyler, University of Texas Permian Basin, we have to plan on those universities now at about 7,000 or 8,000 enrollment of being universities of 15,000. There's a real priority where it's not is immediately obvious to an awful lot of people.
And that is hard in the legislature, isn't it, to plan in the long term?
You have to create a near-term crisis about a long-term issue.
It's true. Right.
And that's a trick. And so, I mean, it's not a trick. I mean, it's I think it's an art. And to me, deadlines and explaining the future, a lot of times people don't realize, okay, well, you know, we only meet every other year, and therefore to solve an issue by, you know, 2020, we don't have that much time. I mean, because we're only going to meet a few more sessions before that shows up. And so I think you got to, you know, again, it's important to make the case.
So the engineering building really needs to fall down in the next 5 weeks.
Well, by some accounts it may, yes. Okay, so let's run through, I want to run through a few specific things. So what kind of movement do you anticipate, or if at all, on the top 10% rule this time? Been a moving target since inception. Is there any reason to expect it will not be a moving target this time?
Well, it's set to be sunsetted under current law. The reforms are. So we had the top 10% rule, and in 2009, we passed the reform package, and that was set to be reviewed again, all come up, go out of existence unless it's continued in the 2015 session, the next session. So in one sense, you'd say, interested to hear the senator's perspective. In one sense, you say, okay, it is what it is, and the reforms seem to be working at schools like UT Austin, where it was particularly focused. We're heading toward a top 7% paradigm here, keeping 25% headroom in the class, growing the class, but even beyond what the Commission on 125 wanted, but showing flexibility and growth, but not so much to hurt quality. So you could say, well, in some sense, the quality and diversity seems up. The interim reports, we're getting annual checkups on how things are going. So you can say, well, everything's going fine. But for the Fisher case going up to the U.S. Supreme Court and probably not being decided until June, late June, mid-June, when we're done, unless there's some special session, then to me, the one piece of the reform package from '09 that called for everything to come undone if there was a final ruling changing the admissions policies. So to me, at a minimum, I would say we should go in and be wise and take that one piece out of the reform package, the killer amendment, take it out, and so that, and if people that want to revisit it, they have a grand opportunity on the next session to decide whether or not this experiment in the reform package has worked. And we'll have a full, robust debate to change any of the reforms that people want or go back to an old system. But at a minimum, it doesn't seem smart to me to put ourselves in a position where we sort of have chaos in UT admissions policy because we didn't look ahead and say there's a chance that the Supreme Court could rule a certain way that all the reform package goes out of existence while we're not in session.
So you would justify that by predictability, the value of predictability?
Just looking ahead and say we ought to do something now at a minimum.
Sure.
And there may be something else.
The problem is
think?
predictability, because if the Fisher case is lost, top 10% will dictate over the next 3 or 4 years 100% of the entering class in the University of Texas. To me, that is ridiculous. It also doesn't really do what was intended to do, which was to increase minority enrollment. And so what I'm going to try to do is get with the people in the Senate and pass a bill that does, as the chairman says, re-implements those limits that caps the amount of the entering class that is dictated by top 10%. Then to me, it's an easy leap of faith, because there is every evidence that the administration of this university, which is really the only one affected, to a lesser degree A&M, intends to, by whatever device, increase minority enrollment. And so if it's not those measures that are under assault by Fisher, it will be something else, and we need to support it. But we need to make sure that there is a safety valve here, so entire admission is not dictated by 10%, because that in and of itself is not the key to increased minority enrollment.
My gut feeling is you don't have too tough a road on that to pass that in each chamber. That seems doable. Is that?
I tend to be overly optimistic whenever there's a good idea, so we may rely on his view, somewhat more rational.
As the president will remember, it was a pretty tough road in '09.
Yeah.
And so a lot of these issues create a lot of emotional fervor, at least in our chamber. The Senate's much more, subdued.
Well, maybe I think the emotional fervor takes place somewhere else. Maybe.
Yeah, so I hope we can get this done. What it doesn't seem to make sense is to have a situation where we're not in session and we can't call ourselves into session, as you know, Professor, unless the governor calls us in. So it doesn't seem to have a situation arise where potentially north of 30,000 students could, by right of law, all descend on one campus. That seems silly. And there was nothing in the law before the reforms to prevent that when it happened. There was no remedy. There was only a remedy a few years after you lived with something like that you started having some lottery to scale back against top 10. It was I guess when the law was originally passed, that it just wasn't anticipated we'd ever get to that point, and we got to that point much quicker.
Once again, the tricky question of anticipating growth.
Yeah, exactly.
Here and this comes up in the top 10 issue, we tend to focus a lot on the issues in the flagship, obviously here, but both of you have talked quite a bit in other settings that I've seen you in about kind of the need to sort of have a more broad view of the higher education system, coordinate the different parts of that system a little bit better, community colleges, high schools, and the four-year schools. For an audience that may or may not think about that a lot, talk about why that's a good idea, Senator Seliger. What Texas gets out of that, why you think it's important, because I've heard you speak eloquently about it.
We end up, if we do it right, with an educated workforce through our entire workforce, not just those who are educated in flagship universities, but have great opportunities in all the universities. One of the most unique universities in the system is Texas A&M Galveston. All marine science, a small institution. 80% of a graduating class goes to work within 90 days in well-paying jobs. University of Texas, Dallas, which aspires to be, and I think is very rapidly, getting to be the MIT of the South. And so I view higher education as a system in and of itself. with different elements to do things differently or funded differently, that has different areas of excellence, but that's the fundamental point. We must foster excellence for everyone who seeks higher education, whether it's this flagship or another university.
Yeah, I agree. We filed some legislation trying to make the ease of transfer better. I saw there was I guess an announcement maybe today between ACC and UT about having a collaborative approach to transfer, and also going back and allowing completers of a 2-year college to get their associate's degree, sort of making sure that here's one of the things that I guess people need to know is that the world, so to speak, looks for measures to define educated workforce. And so if you've got groups that are looking around to say, okay, does Finland have a high quality educated workforce, or does the United Kingdom, or does Canada, or Mexico, or the United States? One of those measures is, well, they just sort of say, well, how many degrees, how many credentials? What sort of credentials? Do they have a certificate? Do they have a associate's degree? Do they have a bachelor's degree? So at some point, when you're comparing the large developed countries of the world, people are looking at a state like Texas and say, how many BACs, that's the acronym, bachelor's, associates, or certificates do they have in their workforce, in their adult workforce? And how educated is their adult workforce, and how ready is it? And therefore, corporate relocation takes place on the basis of this. And capital around the world moves on the basis of this. And so it's real important that, of course, we have the quality. I mean, the certificate, the associate's degree, the bachelor's degree, the graduate degree has to mean something. And the faculty is the great, to me, the preserver of quality at any institution. And so we have to have quality. That's a given. But then we have to have quantity, and that's why I've been really pushing, one of the other, I talked about a higher ed, a headline for the state of Texas. I'd say a headline for higher education in Texas would be, we have to, will Texas higher education complete more of its students? Question mark. And the answer is, and in a more timely fashion, more effective, efficient ways. And President Powers just wanted to lay down a pretty high gauntlet for himself and this university, that the entering class of this past fall will graduate at 70% rate and a 4-year graduation rate. That's a big goal. and I think he could have been timid and said, hey, 60, and everyone would have applauded at the Capitol and said, wow, that's a great number. But he laid down a really high marker. Other university presidents have done the same thing. They've acknowledged, in fact, acknowledged embarrassment that their completion rates are not stronger for the 4-year, 5-year, and 6-year. And this is really important because it sends a message that we're going to have an educated workforce. And also, if we do this in an effective way, then we got more financial aid dollars to recycle for new students incoming. The longer someone stays in higher ed, if you need it and you're getting an education, you ought to be there. But if you're not, we ought to pass the baton to the entering class, so they get the financial aid, or they get the seat in the classroom, and they get their chance at an education. So this is important, the completion process.
You raised the issue of completion, and that really broaches then another subject I think is going to be on the table in both your committees. I know you've introduced a bill about the share of GR that is awarded according to measures of student success. I mean, a couple of questions about that. I think your bill raises the current language from 10 to 25%. Curious where the 25% number came from, and where do you think that's a reasonable number? But also, how do you implement? How do you see a system like that implemented in a way that is fair across the board and comes up with criteria for assessing that is fair to institutions of different types that you're both saying we need? And we have institutions that do a lot of very different things in different parts of the system, and it seems to me the devil is really in the details of those criteria. So where did the number come from, and how do we figure out fair criteria?
Since you asked about the number, I'll start and then I'll defer. I don't want to filibuster. That's only allowed in the Senate. But let me, be quick.
It would send the wrong signal to the students, wrong lesson.
A staff member of a Democratic member of the House who was ahead of my staff member stopped and let our guy have 25 because he was gracious. And so I think he owed my staff guy something. And I don't know if it was a beer or something, but so that was nice, I mean, for the optics. But the point was this. We had passed House Bill 9 last session. Senate, House, Governor signed, and that said that this time around, the coordinating board, the higher ed coordinating board, would recommend in their base budget recommendations that 10% of the formula funding, this is the main formula funding, largely based sort of a per capita funding system, would have at least 10% of it based on the outputs. Right now we have a funding system, a formula that focuses largely on one outcome: enrollment, matriculation. I mean, how many students are in seats on the 12th or really technically the 20th day of class, okay? And if you have those people there in the seats, boom, we get money. But no one's saying, well, how many people are there at the end of class, or how many people actually completed the class, or how many people actually completed their degree. And so this is a funding system that came about when enrollment was really important. We wanted people to get education beyond high school. So we said, hey, we're going to give money to people, to universities and colleges if they enroll people. We want to grow a more literate Texas. And so this was a product of the 50s and 60s where we were expanding enrollment. And so today, if we were designing a system, I think, given our concern for completion, we would say, okay, what do we want to incentivize here? Starting, because we got to grow. We got to make sure we keep an inventory of educated workers, but to really show that they're educated by the world standards, they got to complete. I mean, sure, taking 3 out of 4 years gets you some more education. You're going to be a more engaged citizen. You may be able to get a job, but if you have a degree, statistics say that's better. So I would think if we were doing the system today, Jim, we would say, okay, we want a 50% on the front end and like 50% on the back end, and we want to encourage both starting and finishing, and in between, that's the faculty's job. And so the 25% is something. We have a lot of states that are moving beyond 25% already. We have the state of Tennessee that's basically gone to a 100% outcome system. As one person said, you guys fund an outcome, the outcome you fund is starting, which a lot of people think is an input, not an output. But so I'm just trying to move the conversation along. We're going to have a discussion in Senate Finance and House Appropriation as to whether we're going to accept the recommendation of the coordinating board to go to 10% this time. The 10% is based on graduations, not just a graduation rate. It's something that all the higher ed came together in the summer and worked over the interim and worked on and agreed to. And both community colleges and higher eds have come up with outputs that they've agreed upon. And so this is something that actually, if you had 3-year type rolling averages of these metrics, it's actually probably will move us toward a more stable funding system than, if you're a college president somewhere and you're in an area where you're having a tough growth area, if you're entering class drops 2 or 3, 4, 5%, your budget's dropped 3 or 5%. Whereas if you were funded partly on metrics that you bought into, agreed to, and you had an average growth toward those metrics, you're going to have a steady, gradually growing situation. Also, a university like UT Austin that can't grow in a sense where we're sort of reaching a capacity level, then there's no upside. So they don't have an upside for front-end growth. So where are they going to get their extra funding? You would think this would be a great place that would want to be incentivized on the back end because we can improve the completion process. So there's upside for more stable funding. So that's where it came from. My bill, just to be clear, Jim, my bill is talking about that the coordinating board 2 years from now will recommend that the next budget, not the current budget that we're writing, not the current biennium that we're in, the previous budget, but the budget to come in the 2015 session, which looks forward 2 years, that at that point, that 25% of the formula funding would look toward outcomes.
So message, don't be scared right now.
Yeah, but I mean, let's get with it. Yeah. I mean, if we were designing the system today, I bet you people would put more than 25% on the backside if we were designing the system today.
So Senator Seliger, you have, what, 9 community colleges in your district, is that right? Or
6 community college
six
systems,
community college systems in your
and 2
district.
universities.
So how do you look at all this?
Outcomes-based funding, I think, is inevitable, and I think it's productive. We ought to look at what the end product is and what we expect and how to get there. And I agree with Representative Branch. Just getting people in and getting them sit down, there is some value to it, but there is so much more value that the university has and we should expect. We've got to be careful about a one-size-fits-all sort of situation, because you're going to have in some Hispanic serving institutions and small institutions an entirely different population, expectation. You're going to see a larger number of kids who are the first in their generation to go to college. You're going to see a higher rate there that do not finish in 4 to 6 years. At the same time, in a place like A&M San Antonio, which is an upper level university, so their intake are highly motivated and experienced college students. They're going to have figures that A&M and University of Texas can't possibly meet, should they suffer by comparison, and they should not. And so we need to determine in some ways what our criteria are going to be. There will be a variety of them. How are they scalable so it's comparable so that everybody is sort of under the same pressure?
The legislature is not a bad place for something like that because of geographic representation, right, in terms of that conversation taking place.
It's supposed to be a representative place.
Presumably. I want to do a couple of things quickly. We're going to run out of time, but there's a couple of things I have to ask, or my conscience won't be clear. Okay, so first, in a room full of students, financial aid. Last session was a pretty tough one for student financial aid. Looking any better this time?
Yeah, I hope so. I hope so. And we mediated or remedied what appeared to be a really tough situation at the end.
Right.
At the very end of the budget, I think we ultimately only had about a 10% haircut to the financial aid Texas grants.
Right.
And then remember, putting it in relative terms, the previous session we'd had a dramatic increase, in nearly $400 million increase in the Texas Grants program, our largest program. So yeah, I hope so. I mean, it's important that not be a showstopper, and we ought to, those have a true need, we ought to look for ways to get them educated.
In the Senate budget, Texas grants remain about level. There's a proposal by the coordinating board to cap those Texas grants at $5,000. And I understand it. They can spread them around to a lot more people. But once again, does that do everything the individual institutions need to do with those grants and aid? And I would argue, kind of in light of the Fisher case, that in order to recruit some students a university may want, that if it requires a little more money, isn't that worth it? Once again, the question really distills down to net how much money goes into those Texas grants. If funding in higher education didn't increase in any other area, I would like to see it increase in Texas grants because the young people need them, and the university needs the young people.
And of course, I have to ask you about conceal and carry on campus.
It's time for him to go first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You guys, for or against, and what are the prospects? The chief proponent last time, Senator Wentworth, now no longer a member of the legislature, but the bill in the Senate's been picked up by Senator Birdwell. What do we think?
I voted for the bill twice. I never introduced the bill. I don't think it has some of the harmful effects that people say it does. Keep in mind, those people are all going to be over 21 years old. They will all have had a security check and a pretty decent one, and some minimal amount of training. They can carry those guns on campus now, but not in buildings. So how much of a difference does it make intrinsically? Not that much. I think that since we know that bill is going to be introduced, it's passed the Senate twice, I think it would be useful for the universities to weigh in, and not just with objections or approval, in the case of the Student Senate at Texas A&M, but talk about what their concerns are if it does pass and it becomes law, and we ought to listen.
Yeah. So I'm acknowledge I'm a TSRA endorsed guy. I'm a gun owner, a hunter, and I value the Second Amendment rights and the history behind that, the true history behind that. And we haven't had someone file a bill in the House chamber yet, but as mentioned, Senator Birdwell has filed it in the Senate. In reading the bill, which I have, it's interesting that the bill itself places off limits hospitals on university campuses and preschools, elementary schools, and secondary schools on university campuses. So it's interesting that the bill itself has exceptions, and it has also exceptions for dormitory storage, and it creates an exception for private universities can make rules and regulations regarding the concealed handgun carry. So for me, my sense is I'm not sure that there's a need for a one-size-fits-all on this issue. It seems to me that this issue might lend itself better for a board of regents or board of trustees in the community college to have a discussion about a particular region or a particular community or a particular institution, what the majority in those places want to have. What type of place do they want to have? I mean, the bill calls for taking hospitals and preschools and elementary off limits. Well, because of the Newtown, Connecticut incident, tragedy, we're having a big, broad discussion about having guns on campuses of elementary schools, right? And K through 12 institutions. So for me, this is a very emotional issue that people have those reasoned arguments on either side about safety and about liberty and rights. And so to me, the issue should be best settled by, does a UT Board of Regents, what do they think about institutions under their purview? What does a board of trustees in a community college system? What do they think? Like Alamo College in San Antonio has a lot of institutions, Dallas Community College District in mind, a lot of campuses within their system. They may want to have a different policy for different campuses within their system because the community and the location and the students there may have a different feel. This also may give us an opportunity to have sort of laboratories out there and develop better best practices, better policies in relation to safety on campus. Obviously, we just had an incident this week, in the last 2 days on the Lone Star campus. We're still trying to get all the facts on that. I think we have the gun and one of the accomplices in the incident is still being under investigation. They're doing a search for him. So I think this is an issue that needs to be dealt with. I just think that maybe the better approach is to deal with it on an institution by institution basis.
Be a little more finely grained than a top level kind of
one size
solution.
fits all. Yeah.
If you were teaching a civics class here, one of the things, given our experience, you would say is, and I would advise somebody, since this has passed the Senate twice, introduce it in the House and see what happens. Because more than likely it would pass the Senate a third time. This is just pragmatism, but that comes from people who don't have enough time to waste the effort on something that is going to have things stacked against them.
I'm getting the sense that it's not the highest priority of either one of you.
No, as a chairman, out of respect for the senator, it will get a hearing in Senate Higher Education. I think that's my role.
In our chamber, it's gone to the Public Safety Committee the last 2 sessions. So we have a lot more committees than the Senate, so you never know where these bills are going to end up.
You want to pat us?
You can say that again.
You want to pat us down before we leave?
I don't. Okay, I'm going to give you one last question before you open it up, and this is a little bit of an odd question, but I did a podcast yesterday for a group, and I was asked a question about both you guys, and I had to make up an answer. And I said, basically, well, I'm going to see him tomorrow. You guys, we had done this a couple days later. But the person asked me, he said, both of these chairmen went to private universities, have private higher education background. Do you think that affects their view of public education as chairs in a public setting?
I've never had cancer, and yet we will deal with issues at University of Texas Southwestern and MD Anderson, and we can go on and on and on. As a businessman, as an employer, I realize profoundly the value of higher education in the workforce and to a population that is growing. And so I would say it has shaped my perspective to a degree in higher education. but its validity or its commitment, not a bit.
Yeah, I think I've got 5 kids, and 4 of them went to public university. I traveled the state. There's a million and a half students now in our higher education system. 39 four-year institutions. Depending on how you count, 10 or 11 medical schools, and on and on. We've got a lot of resources and assets in public higher education. We also have some really fine private institutions like SMU in my district, and Rice, and TCU, and Baylor, and on and on and on. So there's at least 44 that are members of an association that comes up here and pays attention to what we do, and we have tuition equalization grants that they care a lot about. And so I think there's a healthy role for both, and you get competition is proved to be a good thing. But yeah, I think if we're going to continue to be a leading state as we approach our 200th anniversary in 2036, public higher education is going to be one of the game changers for whether or not we, stay at the top of our game. And so I'm all in wise investment in higher education.
This is how we are going to educate the majority of young people in the state of Texas, our public institutions. And so regardless of our experience, we are obligated to work hard to achieve the highest level of excellence we can in those public universities.
That's exactly what I said.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, guys. I'm going to open it up to questions. So please wait for the microphone, and we'll take a couple of questions. And please say who you are. Identify yourself,
yes,
if you
sir.
would.
Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today, first of all, on behalf of Jim Henson's intern class. My name is Armin Hazarian. I'm again, UT student, government German major, and I intern by Representative Tryon D. Lewis's office. I'm sure you gentlemen are very well familiar with him. Yes, sir. The question I have for y'all relates to the low producing programs initiative that was actually decided on today, is an amendment decided by the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board today regarding lower producing programs. And this amendment pretty much raises the requirements for where a program would be considered low producing. And again, as I say, this decision was reached today. My question to you is the idea that this has possibly a detrimental effect on many universities across the state, primarily those, especially in the Permian Basin, where population is an issue. I guess one part of the question would be, why peg low-producing programs against the rest of the state, whereas population is a huge determining factor of a college or a university that may necessarily have a program that doesn't produce as many graduates as another university in Texas. As a matter of fact, the University of Austin has also faced a few of these as effects from the low-producing program. 3 of our programs are facing being phased out because of this. My question to you is there any other way to go about this? Any after-the-fact legislative action that we can take? I mean, the committee board has already reached a decision, but is there anything we could do in the Senate or in the House that could somehow check the effect of this?
Well, there's something that we can do, and what I told the coordinating board is, and they did table this measure today, was I'd be more than happy to have a hearing and bring in university presidents and the coordinating board people and talk about this. And it's easy to say that you need to have 5 graduates in a given major or discipline every year for a 5-year period, 40 of them in a 5-year period. But once again, I default to the one-size-fits-all, and I assume I have a different approach to some question, but I don't know what that is. But let's talk about a physics major, a physics degree, University of Texas Permian Basin. Very, very few of them. And so you can say, well, we're going to do away with that major, but how can you not have physics if you're going to have an aggressive engineering program, which is exactly what happens? You can say you have very few graduates, master's degree or PhDs in English, and so you're going to drop them. But keep in mind in terms of cost, you have somebody teaching a few undergraduate classes. There's not a great deal greater cost in teaching graduate students. And I don't know that you can bring in the very best faculty if you say you're going to have a few classes of undergraduates, but you will not have the research available or assisting that you're going to get with master's level and doctorate degree students. And so we need to talk about what this does. To me, this is very, very much a management issue. And clearly, the regents of the system are willing to allow this and to incur the cost for this program to exist. This, to me, is very much a management question. That's up to the regents' administration of the system and the university.
Want to weigh in on that? Or?
Yeah, I thought that was well said. I mean, look, obviously the coordinating board's probably the intentionality is to try and be efficient with the resources, and I think there's always those commissioners and the board members and the commissioner of higher ed, Dr. Paredes, are concerned with being efficient use of resources for the state. And so I appreciate their intention and their concern for efficient use of resources. The solution, I tend to agree with the chairman on how we best manage that regents of the individual systems should be managing the efficiency of those resources, and to dictate that in sort of a one-size-fits-all approach may not be the best way to manage that efficiency.
I think we have time for one more. I promised 4:30, so, okay, right here in the front, microphone, please. This young man was the earliest arrival, so I'm glad he's got that.
Yeah.
Front row.
Do I stand up or?
You can do whatever. Just introduce yourself. You can sit.
Okay. My name is Sam Hagan. I'm an intern for a group called Focused Advocacy downtown. They represent municipalities and energy groups. My question is about how y'all were saying that y'all would like to try and find ways to provide revenue for higher education through more outcome-based kind of strategies, right? And provide revenue through the back end. What I'm curious about is, do y'all worry about any kind of negative effects that a strategy like that could have? Like, for instance, a strategy like that, is it possible that some schools that just don't perform as well because of reasons other than faculty and staff, maybe budget cuts or maybe just low student enrollment, is that something that y'all try to take into consideration?
Yeah, I think you always want to be careful about unintended consequences, and so I think phasing in changes. We're not talking about going to the Tennessee system 100% based on outcomes. We're not talking about going to 50%. We're not talking about going to 75% or 80. I mean, we're taking a pretty modest step. This is only 10% of the budget, and this is only forward-looking. And these university administrators have had a chance to see this coming now for many years now. So I think we're being careful. We've had a lot of time to vet this. We've had, in the interim, committee formed, task forces formed with college leaders and community college leaders to try and come up with the outcomes that they want to incentivize. And so, but at some point, there's a shared responsibility here, and so students, faculty, administrator, everyone needs to push to complete. I mean, we want to have, the goal is to have engaged whole citizens who are giving back in terms of taxes and input and economic development in the state. And so to get there and have a greater chance, we need people to have skills. They don't have to have a 4-year skills. They don't have to have a 4-year certificate. They just have to have various skills for the field they want to enter. And ultimately, the story of education has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And at the end is when people tend to want to hire students at the various levels, whether it's someone who's going to be in the trades, We have a huge need for plumbers. We have a huge need for welders. We have a huge need for nurses. These guys are making high 5 figures, sometimes 6 figures compensation packages. So there's a great need up and down the workforce scale for educated, skilled workers at various levels. And we just need to have people ready at all those levels. And so for me, part of the funding system, as a wise person told me several years ago, when we wanted to have more PhDs in the state of Texas many years ago, we put more money behind PhD programs. And the university systems responded and had more graduate programs. And when we want to have encourage completion, the conclusion of the education story and the entering of the workforce, then we need to incentivize the conclusion.
Sam, I think you'll agree that the idea of outcome-based funding or criteria is a valuable concept. We do it in almost everything else. It's not enough that you come here and you love it and you like being here. There needs to be something on the other end. The most important thing here is not whether or not we implement outcomes funding based enterprise, but if we are open-minded enough to look at those things that work and don't work and are willing to change them. We should always be willing to countenance change. Not just change, but improvement. How can we make things better? How can we improve some results? Because quite frankly, we need your seat in this university for another young person. The question is, over what period of time and what must you have accomplished by then? Is this the way to do it? Yeah, partially in some way. And we'll be back 2 years or 4 years from now and give ourselves a report card on it and then act on that.
I think we'll close on the report card. Gentlemen, thank you so much. We know you're both very busy. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.